So good morning, my name is Rick Fletcher, and we're going to give a short presentation about the product Anuew. We launched Anuew in 2016, and numerous people have just been starting to get to the experimental stage and gaining more and more use and trust in the material. So I wanted to go through some of the features and benefits today as we talk about Anuew. And one of the things I want to say to you just to start off is that Anuew, being a late-stage GA, we have other products that are late-stage GAs. However, it is a very different product compared to products like Primo, Trinexipec Ethyl. And I'll go through some of those things with you as far as how it differentiates itself and what it does. But some of the things I'll say as bold statements in the beginning are that you're going to see that Anuew has a different growing degree day or in-plant metabolism life compared to Trinexipec Ethyl. And basically it lasts longer in things like bent grass and in POA. The other thing that I'll say to you is that Anuew has a different level of activity, and that is we can find that lower levels of Anuew will give the same growth effects as higher levels of Primo. So that has an effect not only on the grass growth, but also on your pocketbook. And finally, when we look at warm season grasses, it's got a very different profile in what it does with warm season grasses, and particularly Bermuda grass. So we'll discuss some of those features. So being a late-stage GA, some of the things that's important to understand is that late-stage GA materials like Trinexipec Ethyl and like perhexadione calcium do have a great advantage over the early-stage GA materials like fluprimidol and paclobutrazol, in that we have a definite line in the sand as far as creating carbohydrate partitioning with late-stage GA inhibition. And of course, for cool season fellas, that's a great benefit because we think about POA and managing carbohydrate reserves through the season, and we can get that benefit from a late-stage GA where we do not get that from an early-stage GA. So we typically see that in differences in color, and I'll show you some pictures in a second where just some ideas of when we get that partitioning, the plant responds very differently. So these are typical. This is some work we did with Doug Soldat years ago in Wisconsin, and you can see doing nothing on the one side and doing the Anuew on the right. And this is very typical. We get this slight coloration difference, and again, this is all about the carbohydrate partitioning. So what we're telling the plant is, instead of you sending energy up to the leaves, keep that energy in the crown and the root zone. And that, of course, translates into a different growth expression. And this is a picture of a fairway out in California where we did no treatment in Anuew, and again we see those subtle color differences. And again, this is all related to the fact of being a late stage GA as well as carbohydrate partitioning that creates from that effect. So when we look at the label, it's basically labeled for anything that you want to do in a golf setting. Green sticks out of the ground, you can squirt it. So tees, fairways, greens, things like that are all labeled for the product. A variety of grasses are labeled, so all of the cool and warm season grasses that we would experience in a golf setting are all labeled for this, and we have data looking at growth regulation as well as the growing degree day models for these grasses. The other thing you'll see is a very broad rate range on this product. So it does have a 2 to 12 ounce range, and if you get to look at the label is broken up very specifically into several boxes, and that would be how much to use on a green, how much to use on a fairway, and then some specifics about what to do for particular grasses. And that's all about, we know that from Bill Kreuser's work that when you have different heights of cut, that affects how much chemical the plant's going to intercept. And the more it intercepts, the greater the growth regulation that we see. So you'll see these differences when I flash up the growth percentages, the growth reduction percentages, and the growing degree day metabolisms. You'll see those differences reflected in the greens numbers versus the fairway numbers. So what this label does is allow you to have a broad flexibility across all those situations. So one of the other things that we see is a very different expression on POA, and of course that's an important part for most superintendents in the cool season market. I always kid folks, superintendents, that you're either growing bent grass that you're trying to kill the POA, or you're growing POA. You're managing for POA. And being that said, Anuew gives you a very different presentation across what it does for POA, and we're going to find that it's more aggressive and a little bit longer lasting. So to give you the idea about the rate differentials, this was some work done in Michigan, and you can see here the growth effects of Anuew at 4 and 8 ounces compared directly with the growth regulation of Primo at 6 and 12. And we can consistently see that lesser amounts of Anuew being slightly more active than Primo, can give us this regulation difference. When we look at the growing degree day models, this is work that's been done, magnified over the last few years to try to help us get to a more exact application of our PGRs. You get models like this, and you can see where the Anuew, the Primo, and the Trimmet all break out differently as far as the interception and the initial reaction, the amount of regulation, and the duration of that regulation, which then gets expressed in growing degree days. So when you put it into a big chart, you get a chart like this. And you can see here very clearly that you look at the growth suppression and you can see the differentials in there. Most are in the 25 to 40% range. But what you do see is that breakout in growing degree days, with Primo being somewhere in the 200 to 230 range, but Anuew being up around 280. So that's a difference of somewhere between 50 and 80 growing degree days. So in the spring, that could be a week or 10 days. In June or July, that could be an extra 3 or 4 days. And the benefit of that, I believe, is for those folks that stay on a calendar schedule. If they're on a 7 or a 14-day schedule, this gives you more flexibility as far as not going in and out of rebound for cool season grasses. So it gives you a longer in-plant life. But you can see the differences here, and Anuew breaks out somewhere between 20 and 40% suppression, depending on the conditions, as well as 280 growing degree days. So it does differentiate itself. So we move over to Fairways, and the numbers all jump around. And the reason for that is that, remember that if we're mowing a green at a 110, 120, 125, and we go out to a collar and a fairway, we're now up to 350, 400, 500 as far as our mowing height. And with that said, more leaf blade, more interception area, more chemical, we see a difference in regulation. So you start to jump these around, and immediately you can see this is a comparison in 2 ways. One, the change from greens to fairways. Look at the amount of suppression jump from 30% range up to 60% ranges, and look at the growing degree day changes jumping from 280 up to about 350. So we do see these changes that jump around, and what you're looking at also is what I showed you earlier. You're looking at Anuew on your left at 7 ounces compared to the same regulation of Primo at 11. So again, more active at lower doses, and you see that change in fairways. We move over to the higher rates, and you see a very subtle change in the amount of suppression. You see a very subtle change in the amount of growing degree days. But again, at 15 versus 33 ounces, we're seeing very similar patterns. So you think about the use if you had to go out on a, this is again an economic point, that it's more active at lower doses. So you put that all into a big chart, and you get numbers like this. And you can see here that all of them start to balance out somewhere around 50 to 80% suppression. But there is one that sticks out as far as Cutlass being a little shorter, a little less suppression as far as what it does for the product. And then you see the other ones stick out as far as timing. So Trimmet, of course, does last longer in a fairway in a situation. And we start to think about what that does for us, and I'll talk about this in the warm season grasses. This one you need to be careful of, because if we're out at 400, 500, 600 growing degree days, and you're on a 21-day schedule on a fairway, you could go through that window, make another application, but not have used up all the material that was there the first time, just because of the length of growing degree days. So you end up starting to stack these PGRs on top of each other and magnifying the effect. So we look at what this does across things like Kentucky bluegrass. We did some rate limiting studies, and you can see here 7 up to 5x of 35 ounces. No phytotoxicity observed, but what you're seeing here is a very flat growth suppression. In other words, you don't need 35 ounces. 7, 8 ounces is going to be fine as far as the amount of regulation you get. We move over to perennial ryegrass, and you see a very similar pattern. Again, 7 up to 35 ounces, but the round of suppression we're getting is somewhere between 40 and 55, 58%. So the low doses, the 6, 7, 8 ounce range is probably going to be adequate for most of your applications. So we did a study looking at ryegrass and overseeding, which of course we were doing for the warm season guys, and this got us turned on to something. This is a study done by Joe Roberts in Maryland, and this is a ryegrass fairway that we're overseeding. And 2 points that I would show you. Look to the left versus the lines here in the middle, and you can see outside of the lines, you see a lot more POA than inside the lines. So that's one of the points that we started to notice, is that when we're using this product, we're seeing some subtle effects on the POA that's there. So then we went ahead and made different rates, and we're looking at 7, 11, and 14 ounces. And the part of this study that was interesting, or what we set it up for, was, does Anuew interfere with overseeding? And of course, one of the advantages of being a late stage GA is that it's only foliar absorbed. So we don't have any root interaction, so we don't have any seed germination interaction, versus the early stage GAs, things like Cutlass, things like Trimmet, those you have a seeding restriction of about 21 days or 14 days based on label. With Anuew, you can seed, you can spray, you can spray, you can seed, no interactions. So we did this study and looked at 7, 11, and 14, and then the top line here is where we overseeded. So the things that started to pop out was one, we didn't have any overseeding effect, and two, we were having a subtle effect on the POA. We're watching this POA amount go down. So we started doing some seed head work, and I've got 5 or 6 years worth of this, and this is some work done by Bill Kreuzer in 18, and we looked at applications using the proxy plus Anuew type programs that most of you have read about, and we started looking at what happens. And what you're seeing here is the spike in the seed heads, coming around May 15th, and the suppression related to the proxy plus Anuew program. So we went to Fairways, you see the same trend. Aaron Hathaway did some work while he was at Michigan State, and you get a visual of how much of a reduction we're seeing in seed heads, just as a visual. We went to John Kaminsky in Penn State, greens, you notice the same trend, same pattern, spike and suppression. We moved to Fairways, you see the same trend again, spike and suppression. So it started to give us a clue that we've got something here that is having a very subtle effect, not acting as a herbicide, but in the growth regulation, giving us a very subtle effect on POA, which if you're in that box where you want to start thinking about managing POA or converting POA or even just keeping your POA okay, you can play with Anuew and go in and out of those effects based on what you want to do. So the summaries that I would have for cool season would be this. As far as bent grass, the amount of suppression you're going to see is going to be fairly similar, somewhere around 25 to 30%, which is fine. The differentiation is the growing degree days being at 280 versus 200 to 230. So you've got some longer in-plant metabolism. The other thing would be the activity level. We're more active at lower doses. So that has an economic effect. But that's it for bent grass. When you look at POA, the POA really breaks out differently in the fact that Anuew has a much stronger effect on POA. We can use this in our mixed greens programs to make sure that we manage the POA appropriately. And the other thing that I didn't talk about as far as growing degree days, which is important to mention, is that the growing degree days for POA with Anuew are somewhere around 220, 240. So as you notice, that's pretty close to what we got with bent grass. And the interesting thing there is that historically, if we look at Primo, Trinexipec, that growing degree day for POA was only about 120. And the point there is that historically, if we're using things like Trinexipec, the POA was always coming out of regulation first, and the bent grass was staying regulated. So think about that agronomically. Which grass has an advantage? The POA does, because the bent's still regulated. So now we've got a situation where we've got some very close growing degree days on POA and bent. So now these are balanced out. So one's not getting an agronomic advantage because it's coming out of regulation any sooner. And you guys know that in the summer, which grass is going to outcompete which? Bent's going to outcompete POA. And that's what we see in a lot of situations where we see this subtle effect, this conversion effect that's possible. When we get to ryegrass and fine fescue, again, a very predictable, a very effective growth regulation, and the growing degree days there follow some of the same models in the fairway, being around 350 growing degree days depending on the grass. So we move over to warm season grasses, and hope all of you don't fall asleep. But Bermuda grass, of course, is our prominent grass, and we've seen a lot of differentials in Bermuda grass as far as how it responds to growth regulators. So this is some work done at North Carolina State, looking at some plots, and you can definitely see in here some green plots and some bronze plots. And that's all a effect of the application of the different growing product that was used. And Fred Yelverton did this work, and I popped this up very quickly, and it really highlighted some things. So this is 7 days after treatment. We're seeing some quick growth regulation. We're seeing great growth regulation. We're seeing pretty balanced between the varied rates of Primo and Anuew as far as how much regulation you're getting. You can see a rate effect between 12 and 20 ounces of Anuew. You see Trimmet is not doing anything on this. This was Champion Bermuda. You're not seeing Trimmet do anything as far as the regulation. In fact, you could almost say it's close to stimulating it compared to the non-treated. But my point here is that we did this work because we were seeing these bronzings, this historical effect on Bermuda. And when you go out to 28 days, the scary part is that you still see Trinexipec regulating very strongly. So again, this is at 28 days. So think of your programs being on a 14 or a 21-day window. Again, you are reapplying before the chemical has gone away, so you are stacking. And we ended up seeing these bronzings or these effects. If you put this all together in a nice big chart, we know that Anuew is slightly shorter as far as its growing degree days compared to Primo, as far as 220 up to 125. But that effect has had a positive as far as not letting us stack these growth regulators on top of each other. And I point out this was a trial done at Quail Hollow a few years ago. And what you're looking at up here with the PCA is Primo, a control, and Anuew. So what you're seeing is Primo there on the left. You can see it's regulated. These were all stimping around 12. The growth was all being regulated very evenly. But the color response, the plant, if you want to call it plant health, whatever, the color response in the Primo was faded, if you would. You can see the control. You can see what Anuew looked like. Primo again, and then the control. So we started noticing this direct benefit as far as color. And of course, the other thing that has come out with some of the Bermuda grasses have been the off-types, the genetic off-types that have popped up. Jim Bronson did this work in Tennessee a few years ago and has continued it. And you can see Primo alone not checking up all of the off-types, but then we go ahead and do a blend or a mix with Anuew and Primo, and then we get back to a very balanced regulation across all of these off-types as well as standard Bermuda grasses. So it's got some great flexibility and some fits in a lot of programs. We did some zoysia grass work for those guys that are in the middle parts of the country that grow a lot of zoysia grass. We've done some zoysia grass work as well, looking at the growing degree days, and you can see zoysia grass different than Bermuda. Where Bermuda was around 200, we're out to 400 with zoysia grass. So very long, which means that when you start thinking of programs, Fairways in zoysia grass, 21-day program, it's probably going to be real close, depending on temperature. So what we have for Bermuda grass is that we look at these differentials, and what happens is that we can see equal intensity, we can see equal regulation, but we have a difference in growing degree days. And the big, I think, point that comes out of that is that it doesn't lend itself to being over applied or over stacked because of application windows and growing degree days. So we see a color benefit and an enhancement. And we also have work for those fellows that are looking for paspalums or kikuyas and the zoysia data as well. So just in conclusion, I mean, Anuew is a very different product compared to Trinexipec ethyl. Yes, it's a late stage GA, but it has some very different benefits and applications that can be done for both cool and warm season grasses. And with that, I am finished. Any quick questions from the crowd? All right, so the question was about mixing Anuew and paclobutrazol. So when I hear that question, I also first respond is, you're in box 2. You've got bent grass with a little bit of POA, and you're trying to remove the POA. You're using the paclobutrazol as a herbicide, and that's okay. So we have done that work, and we've gotten mixes which are pretty much in a 3-to-1 ratio. depending on what you want to do, it might be 4 Anuew and 1 trim it. It might be 5 Anuew and 2 trim it. It might be 6 Anuew and 2 trim it. So we've done some of those. And again, growth regulation on each course is very different. We've got agronomics, we have grass types, we have nitrogen levels, which all are interfering or changing those set ratios. So I give those as starting points, and then after that, you got to figure it out for each course. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you'll come back at 1 o'clock. Our Dr. Aaron Hathaway is going to give a presentation on native areas, and I hope you'll all come back for that. Thank you.